Okay, so moving beyond the basics, and the first organ system that we're going to cover in systemic anatomy and physiology is the endocrine system. So, along with the nervous system, the endocrine system plays a role in almost all of our body's functions by helping to maintain homeostasis. However, where the nervous system acts quite quickly through electrical impulses or action potentials, the endocrine system exerts its effects more slowly by releasing hormones into the blood. As you can see depicted in this image here, the endocrine system is made up of organs or tissues called glands, and it is these glands that produce and release hormones. Hormones are chemicals that are released into the blood and would each target a different cell and have different effects. So we have 3 learning objectives to look at the anatomy of the endocrine system, to first describe the function of the endocrine system and briefly how endocrine glands and hormones work, to distinguish between exocrine and endocrine glands, and then to simply identify the 10 major endocrine glands that we are going to focus on in this unit. So starting at learning objective number 1, to describe the function of the endocrine system. So as I briefly mentioned, the endocrine system is made up of a collection of endocrine glands or endocrine tissues, which are scattered throughout the body. Endocrine glands secrete hormones into the bloodstream. Hormones travel through the bloodstream and bind to receptors on target cells. And it is this binding of a hormone to a receptor that causes a cell to respond in a specific way and for the hormone to have its effect. So taking a look at that process a little more closely, and we have our endocrine gland or our secreting cell in yellow here, and these green circles are our hormone. So our endocrine glands will either just secrete or produce and secrete our hormones. They secrete those hormones into the interstitial fluid which surrounds our endocrine gland. From the interstitial fluid, that hormone will then diffuse into a capillary which surrounds all of our endocrine glands. And that hormone can now travel throughout the body in the bloodstream. That hormone will travel throughout the body until it reaches a target cell. So we have a target cell here and a target cell here. And what makes a cell a target cell is that it has a receptor that is specific to that particular hormone. So see how this round hormone can fit into this round part of the receptor here perfectly? That's because these receptors and hormones are specific to one another. If a cell does not have a receptor for a particular hormone, that hormone cannot have an effect on that cell. So our hormones are released from our endocrine glands. They travel through the interstitial fluid into our capillary. They travel around the body in the bloodstream. They then diffuse out of the capillary into the interstitial fluid. They will bind to a receptor on a target cell that is specific to that hormone. And that binding to a receptor is what causes some change in this target cell that allows that hormone to have its effect. Now, in this example, we have receptors that sit on the surface of the plasma membrane. We can also have receptors that sit within the cell, just underneath that plasma membrane. Now, I just wanted to give you one example of a couple of different things that can happen to our receptors within the body. I haven't got a lot of words on this slide because this is not something that I will test you on, but I just want you to be aware of this process. So like any of the other proteins in a cell, receptors are constantly being produced or broken down. So generally, a target cell will have between 2 and 10,000 receptors for a particular hormone, but this can change at any moment in time. So for example, if we have a lot of a particular hormone, the number of receptors on a target cell may decrease. This effect is called down regulation, and it makes a target cell less sensitive to a hormone. So we've got too much of a particular hormone. We don't want that hormone to have such a big effect, so we down regulate the number of receptors so that cell is less sensitive. One example of this is when certain cells of the testes are exposed to a high concentration of luteinizing hormone. We will then downregulate the number of luteinizing hormone receptors that those cells contain. In contrast, when a hormone is deficient, so there's not much of that hormone in circulation, we can actually increase the number of receptors. So this process is known as upregulation, and it makes a target cell more sensitive to a particular hormone. Now, this specific example that I've got on a slide here is one that I think most of us will be somewhat familiar with. So in the green, we have a hormone called adenosine. And adenosine is a hormone or also acts as a neurotransmitter, which we release throughout the day as we exert energy. So we kind of wake up in the morning and we don't have much adenosine. As we go about our day and we exert energy, more and more adenosine is circulating throughout the human body. What adenosine does when it binds to its receptors is it makes us feel tired and sleepy. So the thinking is that lots of adenosine by the end of the day is what actually makes us want to go to bed. Now, we also have this molecule called caffeine, which I'm sure most of us will be aware of. And caffeine in structure is very, very similar to what our hormone adenosine looks like. What this means is that our caffeine molecule can actually bind to our adenosine receptor. And when it's binding to our adenosine receptor, adenosine can no longer bind to its own receptor and have its fatiguing effect. So that's why when we have caffeine, if you have a coffee in the afternoon, it can kind of wake you up because that adenosine can no longer bind to its receptor and have that fatiguing or that sleepiness kind of effect or feeling. What happens though when we have a lot of caffeine is that there's lots of caffeine or lots of caffeine molecules circulating throughout the body. So our brain decides to upregulate the number of adenosine receptors. So now we have lots of adenosine receptors, so more adenosine can bind to those receptors, so we feel more and more sleepy. And now we need more and more caffeine to actually bind to the receptors, so adenosine can't bind to its own receptors and have that alerting or that energizing effect. So I just kind of want to point out that we have our receptors, but that number of receptors isn't consistent. It can actually fluctuate depending on the concentration of that hormone within the blood, as well as the concentration of other hormones or molecules present within our circulation. So now that we have, I guess, a general understanding of how hormones work, so they're released from our endocrine glands, they then travel throughout the blood to our target cell, they need to bind to a receptor to then have their effect. We need to talk about the functions of the endocrine system and the effects that the hormones have. So first and foremost, the endocrine system's role is to help maintain homeostasis along with the nervous system. So all of these points underneath maintain homeostasis are simply examples of how we actually do that. So the first example or function that we've got here is that hormones can influence the storage and utilization of energy. So the best example of that is the release of insulin and glucagon from the pancreas. So let's say we have a big lunch, our blood glucose levels increase. The pancreas will then release insulin, which causes the glucose to be taken out of the blood and stored as glycogen in the liver, in our muscles. And now we have a lower blood glucose concentration. If the opposite occurs, so lunch was a number of hours ago and our blood glucose concentration is now going down, our pancreas will release glucagon, which causes the breakdown of glycogen from our liver and our muscles, which then gets released back into the blood. So we have an increase in our blood glucose concentration and we can use that glucose as energy. So our hormones play a really big role in the storage and the utilization of our energy. Hormones can also affect the regulation of growth and reproduction. So both in the next lecture and when we get to the reproductive system, we're going to talk about a whole range of hormones that can influence growth, puberty, maturation, development of our sex cells, so eggs and sperm, as well as pregnancy and birth. And all of these processes are driven by hormones. Our last example is the control of body responses to external stimuli. And a really nice example of this is stress. So you may have heard of the fight or flight response. This is an activation of the sympathetic nervous system, and it occurs when our body encounters a stressful situation. Now, our body considers stress something like exercising, but it can also consider, an emergency situation as something stressful. Now, what happens in these situations is that our body releases the hormone adrenaline, and this helps us prepare for that stressful or that emergency situation. So, for example, our heart might start beating faster. We might have increased blood flow to our working muscles. We might also have breakdown of glycogen in the liver so that we have a big supply of glucose in the blood that we can use as energy. So that those fight or flight responses are often controlled by different hormones. Now, the way that the endocrine system can impart all of those functions that we talked about on the previous slide is down to the effect that the hormone has on their target cells. So we kind of looked at brief or more general functions of the endocrine system, but exactly how do those hormones affect the target cells, which allow for those effects or allow for those functions. So again, there's a whole range of examples, and I've just listed 5 here, but one example is that when a hormone binds to its receptor, it can change the cell membrane permeability. So how easily things can pass through that cell membrane. An example of that is antidiuretic hormone. So when that hormone binds to the tubules in the kidneys, it allows water to more easily pass through the cell membrane so that we can reabsorb more water and put it back in the blood. We can also have the production or the synthesis of protein or other regulatory molecules when a hormone binds to its target cell. So for example, when thyroid stimulating hormone binds to the receptors on the thyroid gland, it stimulates the production of our thyroid hormones, which are T3 and T4, and we'll talk about these more in the next lecture. The binding of a hormone can also cause activation or deactivation of an enzyme. So when most of our peptide hormones bind to the receptors, they activate second messages within the cell, which then activate or deactivate enzymes within that cell. The binding of a hormone can also alter the secretory activity of a cell. So for example, the hormone gastrin can stimulate the secretion of gastric acid or stomach juices by the parietal cells in the stomach. And lastly, the binding of a hormone to its receptor can also stimulate mitosis or cell division. A nice example of that is growth hormone, which has lots of target cells in all of our tissues, so our tissues, our organs, our bones, our muscles. And when that hormone binds to the receptor, it stimulates cell division, which then obviously results in growth. So moving on from the functions and the effects that our hormones have on a cell when they bind to the receptors, and learning objective number 2 is to distinguish between exocrine glands and endocrine glands. So within the human body, we have 2 types of glands. We have exocrine glands and we have endocrine glands. Exocrine glands, with exo meaning outside and crine or crine meaning to secrete their products into ducts, and they carry those secretions into body cavities, into the lumen of organs, which is just like the inside of an organ, or to the body's outer surface. So for exocrine glands, think about your sweat glands, your oil glands, your mucus glands, and your digestive glands. For our endocrine glands, so with endo meaning within, and crine or crine again to meaning to secrete, these types of glands secrete their products, which are hormones, into the interstitial fluid surrounding the endocrine gland instead of secreting them into ducts. So endocrine glands don't have any ducts. From the interstitial fluid, those hormones diffuse into the blood in the capillaries, and the blood carries them to the target cells throughout the body. Now, because of their dependence on the cardiovascular system or the blood to distribute their products, our endocrine glands are some of the most vascular tissue in the whole body. Now, some of the endocrine glands, which you may have heard about before and that we'll talk about in this lecture, are the pituitary glands. our thyroid gland, our adrenal, and our pineal glands. We also have endocrine tissues, which are not exclusively classified as endocrine glands, but contain cells that will actually secrete hormones. So together with our specific endocrine glands, these do make up our endocrine system. And so these are tissues such as the hypothalamus, the pancreas, the ovaries and testes, the kidneys, the stomach, the liver, and the small intestine. So to give you a bit of a visual and a bit of a recap, we have our exocrine glands on the left and our endocrine glands on the right. Remember, our exocrine glands have ducts, which is just this little bit here, which then transfer the secretions to wherever they're going to go. Our endocrine glands don't have any ducts. Remember, they secrete the hormones into the interstitial fluid, which is like this part here, which then diffuse into the capillaries, which will be surrounding our endocrine glands. So in this example here, this looks like a sweat gland. So the sweat will be produced by the exocrine gland, taken into the duct, and then secreted to the cell's outer surface, or the outer surface of the body. On our right side, we have our endocrine gland, so the hormones are produced in that gland, secreted into that interstitial fluid, diffused into the blood, and then they travel throughout the bloodstream to the target cells. Now, the final learning objective for this lecture, which is only a nice short one, is to simply identify the major endocrine glands. So this is something that we will go over in the next lecture. We will also go over in labs, but the first thing that I want you to know is to be able to identify these major endocrine glands before we then go on to talk about what hormones they release and then what those hormones actually do. So when we talk about the major endocrine glands, these are the 10 glands that we are referring to. So some are specific glands, some are just tissues within other organs that secrete hormones. So starting from the top, and we have our pituitary gland. So our pituitary gland is this structure here. Without sounding too crass, it kind of looks a little bit like a pair of testicles. In a full image of the brain, it is this little structure here. Now, showing a little bit of a close-up image of our pituitary gland sits underneath our hypothalamus, and it's made up of two distinct regions which each function slightly differently and release different hormones. So this anterior portion, or the portion to the front, funnily enough, is called our anterior pituitary gland. The posterior portion, or the bit which is more towards the back, is our posterior pituitary gland. So the whole structure is our pituitary gland. The bit at the front is our anterior pituitary. The bit at the back is our posterior pituitary. Moving down, we then have our pineal gland. So if our pituitary gland is kind of at the front of the brain here, our pineal gland is more at the back here. So you can see it's just that little white structure there. Now, we are going to talk more about the function of the pineal gland in the next lecture, but I just wanted to point out that the pineal gland actually has some really strong ties with the visual system, which is potentially why it's so close to our occipital lobe at the back of the brain here, which is where we house our primary visual cortex. We then have our thyroid gland. So our thyroid gland sits on the anterior surface of the throat or the neck. It sits just inferior or just underneath the thyroid cartilage, which is the cartilage which protects our voice box and in males is known as the Adam's apple. And then on the back of our thyroid gland, so if this is our thyroid gland here, we have these 4 dots in green, and these are our parathyroid glands. So we've had the pituitary gland, the pineal gland, the thyroid gland, and then these 4 parathyroid glands which sit on top of that thyroid gland. Moving on, we then have our adrenal glands. So we have 2 adrenal glands. One sits on top of each kidney. It's a little bit hard to see in this image here, but if we zoom in for a closer look here, we've got our 2 kidneys here. These little hats are our adrenal glands. And much like our pituitary gland, our adrenal gland is made up of two distinct regions that each have different functions and release different hormones. So we are going to need you to be able to identify each of those two regions. We have the adrenal cortex, which is this outer region here. So anytime you see the word cortex in anatomy and physiology, you know it's going to be the outermost layer. Think the cerebral cortex, it's the outermost layer of the brain. So this is our adrenal cortex. This inner portion here is our adrenal medulla. So maybe middle medulla, our adrenal medulla is this portion here. We then have the pancreas, and the pancreas is this little structure here, which is again a little bit hard to see on this image, but we will take a closer look when we talk more about the pancreas. I kind of think it looks a little bit like a cob of corn. It's kind of a bubbly, yellowy color. And the pancreas is a little bit special because it has both exocrine and endocrine functions. So when we talk about the endocrine system, we're going to talk about its endocrine function and how it releases insulin and glucagon. But then when we get to the gastrointestinal system, we're going to talk more about its exocrine function. We then have our ovaries. So in our female example, we have our two ovaries here, which sit either side of our uterus. These produce our female sex hormones. And then in males, we have our testes, which actually sit external to the body, covered by the scrotum. And they mostly produce our male sex hormones. So these are our 10 our 10 endocrine glands that we're going to be focusing on in the next lecture when we talk about the physiology of the endocrine system. We had our pituitary gland up the top here, which is broken into our anterior and our posterior pituitary gland. We had the pineal gland, which sits just posterior to the pituitary gland. We have our thyroid gland, which is this bit on the front of your neck. We had the parathyroid gland, which are these 4 green dots on the back of the thyroid gland. We have our adrenal glands, which are the 2 hats that kind of sit on top of each kidney. The pancreas, which is the one I said looks a bit like a cob of corn, and that sits kind of underneath the stomach and the liver. And then we have our ovaries, which we find in a female population, and our testes, which we find in a male population. So now that is the anatomy of the endocrine system. When we come to the physiology of the endocrine system, we will talk more about these glands, specifically what hormones they release, and then the effect of those hormones on their target cells when those hormones bind to their receptors. Thank you very much.